Hello and welcome back to A Better World. This is your host, Mitchell Rabin, and we're very glad that you're joining us again today. We're going to have another very interesting show. Today we have with us Anne Reynolds, who is the director of the Air and Energy Program of Environmental Advocates. This is a nonprofit organization that has been advocating the proper use of energy and other environmental concerns and issues in the state of New York for many years. So we're very glad to have Anne with us today, who's going to be speaking about some of the pressing issues that are important for all New Yorkers today in the space of and the new situation of deregulation and the other things that are occurring with renewable energy resources and the like that we all need to know about so we can take a more active participatory role in them.
Hello.
Hello, welcome.
Thank you.
Great to have you.
Thanks.
Yes, exactly. So first of all, just give us a little bit of a background on what the situation is in New York State and what, in a sense, Environmental Advocates is stepping into.
Sure. There's so much going on in energy in New York State now. I think there's heightened interest on the state because we deregulated after California, and California's been getting so much attention.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
And not very good attention.
Right, exactly. So that's focusing attention on New York because we're just behind them in terms of deregulation. We also have about 70 plants proposed in New York State, new power plants. About 20 of them are in the formal application stage with the state siting board, and many others are in the pre-application stage. So you've got a situation where community groups all over the state are simultaneously facing new proposals for plants.
Maybe the first thing you could do for our audience, if you would, Anne, is just tell us, what does deregulation mean for the ordinary New Yorker?
Yeah, sure.
What is the meaning of it?
Well,
why is it happening?
Sure. It used to be that the entire process of creating energy, transmitting it, and then distributing it to people's homes and businesses was regulated by the Public Service Commission. And that means that the companies, the familiar names, you know, like Con Edison and Niagara Mohawk, they got their costs reimbursed plus a small amount of profit. And what that meant is...
and that was by the Public Service Commission, which is an agency of the state?
It's a state agency. And that meant that the state had a lot of control, for instance, of where power plants were put, and they were built only when they were needed. So when it was determined that we needed more electricity in the state, there'd be sort of an overall state policy of where to put the plants and when to build them. And when to have distribution facilities as well. And the reason that happened is, if you think about it, electricity is not like other products. It's a monopoly. The wires come to your house. It's not like buying milk. So having it regulated because of its importance and also because of its environmental impacts was a good idea. In the mid-90s, starting in the early 90s, there was a sort of a movement, not just in the United States, but in the United Kingdom as well, to change that setup with the belief that if there's more competition, electricity can be provided to consumers cheaply. And theoretically, that may be a good idea. But as I said, electricity is not the same market as wheat or other products. So it's very difficult to set it up so that there's real competition. So we've deregulated in New York State, for instance, but...
When did that happen?
It happened in 95 and 96.
95 and 96?
Yeah, not too long ago. And the difference here in New York...
But in a sense, it's like very little has happened over the past 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, it's been, in the state,
it's like a well-kept secret.
Exactly. That's a great way of describing it, because it happened on a case-by-case basis in New York, whereas in California, in Massachusetts, it happened with a new law, so there was more public debate about it when it occurred. In New York State, it was done basically by the administration and the Public Service Commission.
So when you say case by case, you mean county by county, or
what used
kilowatt
to be,
by kilowatt?
It's region by region, really. So there was the Con Edison case, then there's the PS&G, the Rochester Gas and Electric, so they did it by region.
I see.
Yeah. And so that's how it was done here.
And very quietly.
Yeah. Yep.
I mean, because only now, and perhaps it's because of California, that it's getting into the news at all.
Yeah, I think so. And there were also many other changes that went along with deregulation. It used to be, when the sector was regulated, that the utilities had to do conservation measures. And you may remember 7 years ago getting some literature from Con Edison
Yes.
about conservation.
Insulation,
Exactly.
windows,
Yeah.
any number of different things.
And they were required to do that because of something called integrated resource planning, where people recognize that if you're going to protect the environment and protect consumers, the best way to do it is to manage demand, not just build new power plants. So the state government started requiring the utilities to promote those projects. And in 1992, for instance, in the state, we were spending about $286 million a year on efficiency measures and conservation. In the process of deregulation, that just plummeted. So up until last year, we were spending less than a third of that in the state. At the same time that the economy was heating up, and so there was more demand for electricity.
Interesting.
It's another reason why
I thought Con Edison did all of that just because of their
they're nice.
thoughtfulness, their thoughtfulness about the environment.
No.
Oh,
Well, they
well.
used to have
It was
more of a
demanded.
public mandate. You know, they used to have
Yes.
a responsibility to provide electricity at the least cost.
Mm-hmm.
And when restructuring happened, that changed too. But
I
it's important to remember that the distribution companies are still regulated. So in this debate, you often hear, well, we deregulated, there's nothing, you know, we can't do that much about it, but that's not actually true. The distribution companies, the places like Con Ed were required to sell off their generation plants to private companies, but they still own the wires, and
Sure.
that process is still regulated.
And the plumbing, the gas lines, the lines and the wires.
Yes.
However, there is a precedent, though, in this kind of monopolistic world of electricity, and of course the other big one was telecommunications, is telecommunications. And no one knew, it looked like a free-for-all a number of years ago. But in fact, it seems like we've landed on our feet, and they have figured out a way, even though AT&T had the wires and, well, 9X and all of that had the wires hardwired into everybody's homes and businesses, they did ultimately figure out a way to work it out so that the prices went from maybe 30 cents a phone call per minute for a long-distance phone call under AT&T to, at this point, 3 to 4 cents or 5 cents a minute.
Yeah.
And that's what you call a dramatic change in pricing.
Right.
Why couldn't this follow the same path?
Right. Well, it's possible that it could, but it's complicated, and I think that was complicated too, which is why it's a good analogy. It's an excellent analogy to say it's a free-for-all, because that's what we're in right now. Because there's so many plants being proposed, there's sort of a gold rush mentality, but in this interim period, there's all sorts of, before we land on our feet, there's all sorts of other proposals being put on the table around the state to make sure that there's electricity, and some of them are very polluting. The difference between electricity and telecommunications is that no one wants to have a power plant next door, and power plants are very polluting, whereas telecommunications are not in the same way.
This is a good point.
So people have concern about it, and it makes sense that new power plants should be based on need, because it has a social cost in the way that a new telecommunications company wouldn't.
Yeah, there are distinctions.
Yeah.
Many similarities and parallels, but distinctions.
Right.
Sure. This sort of dovetails into or segues into the next piece of what I wanted to speak with you about or listen to you about, really, and that is the whole subject of renewable energy, which it seems criminal that in what we call modern society, we are still shoveling coal.
Right.
I mean, it doesn't seem possible, but it is, folks. It's what's really going on.
Right.
And or fossil fuel. I mean, this is an absurdity to me,
Right.
but it is still going on. I know that. I do live in this day and age. What measures are being taken, and what is environmental advocates doing to support what should be our real energy basis?
Right. Well, although there's a lot going on, we wish there was more going on in renewables. There's incredible opportunities for renewables in the States, and experts have
When you say that, what do you mean?
For
Lots
instance,
of wind?
with wind power. New York is windy state, upstate.
Yeah.
It's not just Albany legislators.
Manhattan.
Exactly.
Oh, that's good, right.
But experts estimate that there's 5,000 megawatts of capacity in upstate New York for wind power. And you shouldn't think about the...
What does that mean? What does that translate into actuality?
Well, 1 megawatt is enough to light 1,000 homes. So
For how long?
Well, it's a megawatt hour would be for an hour.
Oh, okay.
So some of the units don't have time associated with them. But
Right.
we use 30,000 megawatts in the state overall right now. That's our peak demand.
I see.
So it could be a big percentage of it. It's not subject to fuel costs. If you think about it, there's some capital investment, but it's not going to go up and down with the prices of oil and the decisions by OPEC. So
Right.
it's a great benefit in terms of energy independence.
Yes.
It can be rural economic
Sovereignty.
development. Exactly. You can put wind farms on other types of farms and have a wind farm and an agricultural operation. And there are, just in the last 2 years, we've had 2 major wind farms constructed in upstate New York.
Really? Where?
Wyoming County and Madison County. So
Fabulous.
they're significant. They're not as big as the 1,000 megawatt plants, natural gas plants being proposed, but they demonstrate, the potential.
What's possible.
Exactly.
And these are state funded?
They're private investment, but there was a state role, and it was funded by what's called the Systems Benefit Charge by the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. And Environmental Advocates has been very active in advocating for more funds to go towards their programs.
Wonderful.
Because, as I mentioned, the utilities aren't, carrying that responsibility anymore. So we need to have, under deregulation, a more aggressive state role in funding these type of renewable programs. And efficiency, too. By efficiency, I mean more efficient use of electricity, more efficient refrigerators, subways,
Sure.
operations.
Systems.
There's a lot of public users of electricity, and we feel that, for instance, and we've called for this, that in New York City, the state commit to a 10% reduction in energy use based on efficiency improvements over the next 3 years. And it's great for the
Excellent.
environment, but it's also good for mitigating price spikes because the prices are highest when peak demand is highest. So if you can reduce peak demand, which happens on those hot, smoggy days where pollution is the worst too, you can have an environmental benefit and a great economic benefit without building a new power plant.
It's so interesting. It's the dog chasing its own tail.
Mm-hmm.
You can be reducing the smog by using less and by using renewable resources.
Right.
So it changes the entire scenario, the whole picture of a problem day,
Right.
of a high peak demand day.
Mm-hmm.
It just changes rather radically.
Yeah. And you mentioned coal. I think here in New York we still have a lot of coal-powered plants.
Where do we get the coal?
From the Midwest.
So there are miners in the Midwest who are in mines and digging and drilling for coal,
Right.
and they put it onto probably trains and they bring it to New York so we can have electricity.
And we burn it, exactly.
And doesn't that seem like the Flintstones do?
It does. And people, when the Clean Air
Unbelievable
Act
to me.
was passed so many years ago, they got a loophole. It's called the grandfather clause, where those coal plants wouldn't have to clean up to modern standards. And that's still in effect, and we're working to get that changed at the federal level. But as it stands now, an old coal plant doesn't have to meet new air quality standards, and many people might not know that.
Good to know. Good to know. But more than anything, for people to know that this is all really based on coal. I mean, just
Yeah.
like,
Right.
industrial England
Yeah.
hundreds of years ago. That's what we're still dealing with,
Right.
so that we can run a light bulb in our New York apartment.
Yep.
Yeah.
And people might not know that there's 6 nuclear plants still operating in New York State. We have a strong dependency on nuclear power in New York. And we're actively working to get that changed too. And it's an interesting issue in light of deregulation, because all of a sudden you have nuclear plants that are subject to competitive pressures. And if you think about that could be worrisome, that there's a pressure for a nuclear plant to operate as cheaply as possible when there's issues of nuclear safety.
Exactly.
So.
Could you say a word about solar? I'm sorry.
Sure.
And any other renewable possibility,
Right.
particular to New York State?
We think that there should be a lot more investment in efficiency and renewables all over the state, and for solar power, the best place is Long Island. We're really aggressively advocating for the Long Island Power Authority to invest in photovoltaics on roofs. And once again, I'm not saying that all of New York's power could be from solar power, but when it's sunniest is the same time when there's peak demand for power. So it's those summer smoggy summer days where we could get the most from solar power.
Yeah.
And there's a couple of things that could help with that. A couple years ago, we advocated for the passage of a net metering law, which means if you installed a solar panel on your roof, at times when you were using the electricity, you wouldn't be buying electricity from a fossil fuel plant. At times when you weren't using it, it would be sold back to the distribution company. So your meter would be rolling backwards. And we want to work this year to get that same net metering for wind power, because it's these small changes that can really promote the use of renewables in the state.
Definitely. Let me ask you, Anne, let's imagine that we were really invested in using renewable resources for our energy needs, and that we were not concerned with vested interests. Okay?
That would be nice.
This is a momentary fantasy, folks. What would be the energy sources of choice, and how much of New York State's needs would be satisfied, do you think?
Right. Well, in the ideal, if we had significant investment, I think we could get, for instance, easily a 10% to 20% cut in energy use just by efficiency improvements, and easily a 10% for renewables, wind. And we already have some hydropower here in the state. The one unknown is fuel cells, and they're almost at the point of commercialization. So we're hoping that investment in fuel cells will allow for very clean power too. It's not quite renewable like wind and solar, but it's extremely clean. So I can imagine a scenario, ideally in 20 years, our power would be sort of equally split between clean natural gas plants, wind, solar, hydropower, fuel cells, and moving away from coal and nuclear in the state, and oil fire too, which is also polluting.
Yes. Wonderful. Well, that's a good thing to aim for.
Yeah.
That's why I said it.
Yeah.
And there's another important point to be made from an economic point of view, which I think has to really be factored into all of this, is that renewable energy does ultimately pay for itself.
Right. Yep.
It is a good investment.
Right.
It does amortize. Money will be made from it. It's just a longer term, it's attenuated.
Right.
But it does work economically smartly for those investors who go into it.
It definitely does. And you need to have the investment, and you need to have the public investment to stimulate it, and then you need to get rid of some of these barriers and disincentives in the system that are the vested interest that you talk about. And there certainly are things that can be done. As I mentioned, the distribution utilities are still regulated, and they make more money the more electricity they move through their wires. And that incentive should be changed. It should be based on their service and reliability, not on how much electricity they sell. And then they would get out of the way of these new technologies.
That's right. That's right. So having to do with public stimulation of interest in these things, do you want to just tell our audience that there is a meeting taking place?
Sure. Yep. Environmental Advocates is having a meeting for our members in New York City. It's open to the public, and it's next Thursday, April 29th, and it takes place at 132 Nassau Street at 6 p.m. We'd love to have people come, and it's a discussion of energy issues on the state level, and also some of the controversial plant proposals and energy issues right here in the city.
Excellent. Well, I applaud you for the work that you're doing and the work that Environmental Advocates is doing. We need you. So thanks so much for being a guest on the show. Absolutely. Well, we have to highlight these most important and pressing issues. So many of us live our lives in a way that we're not cognizant of what's really going on behind the scenes, what with the state, with the government, with the city, and especially with something as vitally important as energy issues. So I'm so glad that Anne was on the show, and Environmental Advocates is doing the work that they're doing, among many other organizations of similar ilk. What's nice about what they're doing is that they're focusing specifically on New York State issues and energy issues at that. So I'm very glad that you were able to see this and learn firsthand about what's going on. And if you want, you can actually participate and go to their meetings and see what it is going on and participate, be part of it yourself. After all, this is about us all. Particularly of interest to me, as you may have noticed in the interview, is the subject of renewable, sustainable resources. This is the direction we are going in, we must go in. We actually, as far as I'm concerned, should have been exploring properly at least 50 years ago when the systems were beginning to get set up and we already had information from Tesla and other great minds, great inventors about how we can create sustainable, renewable energy sources. So I want to just thank environmental advocates and Anne Reynolds' work, and I'm so glad that they've been on the show with us today. Now, switching gears,